My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the story of the night I died. October 14th, 2019 was just a regular shift and just another night on patrol. At least that's what I thought. But what happened that night changed everything I believed about life, death, and what comes after. I never planned on becoming a police officer. Growing up in Fort Worth, Texas, my dream was to be an architect, to design buildings that would stand long after I was gone. My father, Mark, was a high school chemistry teacher, and my mother, Linda, ran a small catering business from home. They raised me with good values, taught me to work hard and treat people with respect. Faith was always present in our house, but it wasn't something we talked about much. We went to church on Sundays, prayed before meals, but to me it was more tradition than truth. I was a skeptic. I wanted proof before I believed in anything. That all changed my first year of college. Fort Worth had been seeing a rise in gang violence, but I never paid much attention to it until it hit close to home. One night, a 12-year-old girl named Maria Lopez was walking home from school when she got caught in the crossfire of a drive-by shooting. She was my neighbor's daughter, a kid I had seen riding her bike in the cul-de-sac, laughing with her little brother. At her funeral, I sat in the back of the church, listening to her mother sob, and something inside me shifted. What was the point of designing beautiful buildings if people weren't even safe walking down the street? That summer, I changed my major to criminal justice. When I graduated from the academy, I thought I knew what I was getting into. I had prepared myself for the danger, for the long hours, for the things I might have to see. But nothing prepared me for the emotional weight of the job. You don't just deal with crime, you deal with people at their worst, their most desperate. Some nights, you're holding the hand of a kid who just lost his parents. Other nights, you're knocking on a door to deliver news that will shatter someone's world. My mentor, a senior officer named James Holloway, told me something that stuck with me. This job will either make you bitter or it'll make you better. The choice is yours. Over the years, I tried to let the job make me better. I learned to keep my emotions in check, to push through the hard days, to focus on making a difference where I could. I wasn't looking for recognition or promotions. I just wanted to do my job, to protect the people in my city. Somewhere along the way, I met Olivia, a trauma nurse at Baylor University Medical Center. We crossed paths after a domestic violence call that landed a woman in the ER. Olivia was strong, kind, and had this incredible ability to stay calm in chaos. We started talking, then dating, and before I knew it, she was my wife. Life settled into a rhythm. We bought a small house, went to church when our schedules allowed, and talked about having kids one day. But work never slowed down. By 2019, I had been on the force for 15 years. I had seen just about everything, or so I thought. That year was one of the hardest. A new synthetic drug was flooding the streets, and we were seeing violent crimes spike across the city. Officers were stretched thin, working overtime, barely keeping up. Morale was low, but we kept pushing forward. My partner, Chris Reynolds, was a younger officer, only 5 years in, but he had a good head on his shoulders. We made a solid team. Then came October 14th, the night everything changed. It started like any other shift. Olivia packed my dinner, chicken stir-fry, my favorite. We kissed goodbye in the driveway, and I promised I'd be home by morning. At roll call, our sergeant warned us about increased gang activity near the stockyards. There had been reports of a new drug operation moving in, and tensions were high. "Be smart out there," he said. "Don't take unnecessary risks. We're short-staffed tonight." Chris and I nodded, but we both knew that sometimes doing the job meant taking risks. A few hours into our shift, just after 2:30 a.m. The call came in. Suspicious activity at an abandoned shipping warehouse off Exchange Avenue. A neighbor had reported multiple people going in and out of the building, possibly armed. I knew the place. It had been empty for years, but lately, it had become a hotspot for drug deals. I grabbed the radio. "Unit 12 responding," I said, requesting backup for perimeter support. The dispatcher acknowledged, but I could tell by the tone of her voice that backup wasn't coming anytime soon. We were on our own. Chris and I pulled up a block away, cutting the engine to avoid drawing attention. The fog had rolled in thick that night, drifting low over the cracked pavement, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The only light came from a single flickering street lamp near the warehouse entrance. Something about the scene felt off, but we had been in situations like this before. We moved in quietly, keeping close to the shadows. Years of experience had taught me to trust my instincts, and right then, my gut was telling me something wasn't right. I should have listened. I should have waited for backup. We spotted movement near a dumpster at the side of the building. Two figures, hunched over, talking in hushed voices. My focus narrowed. This was just another call, another drug bust waiting to happen. I raised a hand, signaling Chris to go left while I took the right. We crept closer, keeping low, using the darkness to our advantage. Then, just as I stepped around the corner, everything exploded. The first gunshot shattered the silence like a firecracker going off in my ear. The second hit me square in the chest, knocking me backward. My vest absorbed most of the impact, but the force left me gasping for air. Before I could react, the third shot came. This one was different. I felt it tear through the space between my vest and my neck. A deep, burning heat spread across my body, but there was no real pain, just a strange warmth and then cold. I collapsed onto the concrete, my vision blurring. I could hear Chris yelling into his radio, calling for backup, calling for an ambulance. The sound of footsteps, gunfire, the distant wail of sirens. It all started to fade. My body felt heavy, my limbs numb, and then, just like that, everything went black. But the darkness didn't last. In an instant, I was somewhere else. It wasn't like falling asleep or drifting into unconsciousness. It was sudden, like stepping through a door without realizing it. One moment, I was lying on the cold pavement, bleeding out under the Texas night sky. The next, I was surrounded by something I can only describe as light, but it wasn't just light. It was alive. It wasn't coming from any one source, and yet it was everywhere, wrapping around me, filling me. The strangest part was that I wasn't afraid. All my life, I had carried fear, fear of failure, fear of losing the people I loved, fear of not being enough. But here, fear didn't exist. It wasn't just absent. It was impossible. In its place was something else. Peace, real peace, deeper than anything I had ever felt before. It was like I had spent my entire life holding my breath, and now, for the first time, I could finally breathe. Then, I became aware of a presence. It wasn't just anyone. It was him. First, I didn't see him, but I felt him. The presence was overwhelming. Stronger than anything I had ever experienced, yet completely comforting at the same time. Every part of me knew exactly who he was, and when I finally saw him, standing there in the radiant light, I couldn't move. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper, awe. Jesus. But he wasn't like the paintings I had seen in church growing up. He wasn't soft-spoken or distant. He was powerful, more real than anything I had ever encountered. more solid than the world I had left behind. His eyes, those eyes, they held something infinite. When he looked at me, I felt completely exposed, like every mistake, every failure, every doubt I had ever had was laid bare before him. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only love, a love so deep, so consuming, that I felt like I would collapse under the weight of it. Then he spoke my name, Daniel, and in that single word, I understood everything. The way he said my name, it wasn't just a sound. It carried meaning, like it held the weight of everything I had ever been and everything I was meant to be. In that moment, I understood that my entire life, every choice, every struggle, every moment I had doubted or questioned, had led me to this. I wasn't just standing in front of him. I was known, completely. Every failure, every regret, every missed opportunity. And still, he looked at me with nothing but love. I wanted to speak, to ask him why I was here, if I was dead, if this was the end. But before I could even form the words, I felt something else. A flood of understanding pouring into me, not through words, but through knowing. It was like he was showing me the truth, pulling back a curtain that had been there my entire life, one I had never realized was blocking my vision. I saw how my life had rippled outward in ways I had never imagined. I saw moments I had long forgotten, times I had helped people without thinking twice, and how those moments had set off chains of events that I had never seen. I saw the homeless man I once bought a meal for, how that simple act gave him the strength to reach out to his estranged son. I saw a woman I had arrested years ago, broken and lost, and how a single moment of kindness in that jail cell had led her to turn her life around. I had never thought much about these moments before, but here, I saw them for what they really were, divine appointments. Every small act of love, every decision, every interaction, it all mattered. Then I saw something else. I saw moments I had missed, opportunities to show kindness that I had ignored, people I had turned away from, moments where I had let my pride or impatience take control. And yet, even as I saw these failures, there was no condemnation, only understanding. It was as if he was showing me, this is what you were meant for. This is who I created you to be. I turned to him, and for the first time, I asked the question that had been burning inside me. Is this it? Am I supposed to stay? His expression softened, but there was an authority in his presence that told me the answer before he even spoke. Not yet, he said. You have more to do. The words hit me like a wave. Not yet. I had more to do. But how? I had just been shot, bleeding out on the pavement. My body was broken. How could I possibly go back? And more than that, why? I didn't want to leave. The peace, the love, the overwhelming sense of belonging. It was unlike anything I had ever known. I couldn't imagine returning to the world I had left behind, to pain, to struggle, to uncertainty. Jesus must have known my thoughts because his expression didn't change. There was no argument, no debate, just a certainty that I couldn't deny. There are people who need to hear what you have seen, he said. There are lives you are still meant to touch. Before I could ask what that meant, he showed me. In an instant, I saw glimpses of the future. People I hadn't met yet, moments that hadn't happened. I saw a man standing at the edge of a bridge, ready to jump, and then I saw myself there, talking him down. I saw a woman, lost in addiction, who would cross paths with me at exactly the right time. I saw my wife, Olivia, holding my hand in a hospital room, tears in her eyes as I woke up. I saw things that hadn't happened yet, but somehow I knew they were real. Then he said something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Tell them the truth, Daniel. Tell them what you have seen. Heaven is not far away. I am not far away. I am with them always. I wanted to ask more, to stay just a little longer. But before I could, everything shifted. The light began to fade. The warmth, the peace. It didn't disappear, but it felt like it was pulling away. A force stronger than anything I could resist was pulling me back. And then, in an instant, the light was gone. I gasped awake, sucking in a breath so sharp it burned my lungs. Everything was loud, voices shouting, the blare of sirens, the distant crackle of a police radio. My chest ached, my head was spinning, and for a second, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it hit me. The warehouse, the shooting, the cold pavement beneath me. "We got a pulse," someone shouted. I could barely open my eyes, but I could feel hands pressing down on my chest, the sting of an 4 in my arm. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. I was back. I had returned. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and pain. I could hear Chris's voice somewhere nearby, frantic, telling me to hang on, stay with them. I wanted to tell him I was okay, not in the way he meant, but in a way he could never understand. Because no matter how broken my body was, I knew something now, something I could never forget. I shouldn't have survived. Later, the doctors told me the bullet had missed my carotid artery by millimeters. They said I had been clinically dead for nearly 12 minutes. By all logic, I should have had brain damage. But I didn't. They couldn't explain it. They called it a miracle. I already knew the truth. The real challenge wasn't surviving. It was coming back to a world that no longer felt the same. How do you go back to normal after seeing everything? How do you walk through life the same way when you've stood in front of God Himself? I had been given a second chance, and I couldn't waste it. I had to tell people what I had seen. First, I struggled with how to talk about it. How do you put something like that into words? How do you explain an experience that felt more real than life itself? I tried to go back to my routine, back to being a cop, back to the same streets I had patrolled for years. But nothing felt the same. Every call, every suspect, every victim, I saw them differently now. Before, I had only seen people for who they were in the moment, a criminal, a victim, a witness. But now I saw souls. I saw eternal beings, lost and searching, hurting and desperate. Some of them didn't even know they were searching for something more, but I could feel it in them. The weight of their burdens, the battles they fought in silence. I knew because I had been the same way. I started noticing things I never had before. The way a man gripped his hands together when he was afraid, like he was praying without realizing it. The look in a woman's eyes when she wanted to ask for help but didn't know how. The way people clung to anger because they thought it was the only thing keeping them from falling apart. And every time, I heard those words in the back of my mind, "Tell them what you have seen." So I did. I started talking. First just to Olivia, then to Chris, then slowly to others. Some believed me, some didn't. Some thought it was just trauma, just a hallucination from nearly dying. But the ones who listened, their lives started changing. Because this wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. The biggest moment came when I got a request to visit someone in prison. His name was Miguel Reyes. He was the man who shot me, the man who left me for dead that night at the warehouse. I had every reason to hate him, to want justice, to want him to rot behind bars. But when I sat across from him, looking into his tired, hollow eyes, I knew what I had to do. "I forgive you," I told him. And I want you to know, God hasn't given up on you." Miguel just stared at me like he hadn't heard me right. Then he let out this short, bitter laugh and shook his head. "Man, don't mess with me," he muttered. "You should hate me. I almost killed you." I leaned forward, my hands resting on the cold steel table between us. "I should," I said, "but I don't." He wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the floor, jaw clenched tight, like he was waiting for me to say something else, something normal, something that made sense. But nothing about this made sense. Nothing about grace ever does. So I told him the truth. I told him about what I saw, about the light, the peace, the overwhelming love, about standing in front of Jesus and realizing that every single person, even him, even me, was more than just the worst thing they had ever done. I told him that when I came back, I wasn't the same, that I couldn't be. His hands balled into fists on the table. He was shaking his head, but I could see it, his walls were cracking. "You don't know what I've done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know what he's done," I answered, "and I know it's enough." That was the moment he broke. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking, and I just sat there, letting him feel it, letting him understand it, that he wasn't forgotten, that he wasn't beyond saving. That day changed something in both of us. For him, it was the first time he had ever felt like God still saw him. For me, it was proof that this wasn't just my story. It was his, and it's yours too. From that moment on, I knew my purpose wasn't just to go back to my life as it was before. Couldn't. Once you've stood in the presence of God, once you've felt His love in its purest form, you can't go back to being the same person. I wasn't just a cop anymore. I wasn't just a man who had survived a shooting. I was a witness. I started sharing my story wherever I could. Not just with my fellow officers, but with anyone who would listen, churches, recovery groups, even strangers who crossed my path at the right time. Some people believed me right away. Others were skeptical. That didn't matter. What mattered was planting the seed. What mattered was helping people see that God is real, that heaven is not some far-off place we go when we die. It's here, now, surrounding us, waiting for us to wake up. I still work in law enforcement, but I see my job differently now. Every call, every suspect, every victim, they're not just people. They're souls. Some of them are lost. Some of them are broken. Some of them think they're too far gone, too deep in their mistakes to ever be forgiven. But I know the truth now. No one is too far gone, and that includes you. Maybe you're watching this because you're searching for something. Maybe you've been running from God, thinking He's given up on you. Maybe you've been living with regret, with shame, believing you're beyond saving. You're not. You have no idea how much you are loved, how much He sees you, even in your darkest moments. Even now, I don't share my story for attention. I share it because someone needs to hear it. Maybe that someone is you. If you're watching this, it's not an accident. You were meant to hear this. If this message spoke to you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Leave a comment. Tell your story. Let others know they're not alone. And if you're struggling, if you feel lost, don't wait. Talk to God. Right now. You don't need fancy words. Just be honest. He's already listening. Thank you for watching. God bless you.